Gone Fishing by James H. Schmitz. Section 1. There is no predictable correlation between intelligence and ethics, nor is ruthlessness necessarily an evil thing, and there is nothing like enforced, uninterrupted contemplation to learn to distinguish one from another. Barney Shard, 37, financier, entrepreneur, occasional blackmailer, occasional con man, and very competent in all of these activities, stood on a rickety wooden lake dock, squinting against the late afternoon sun and waiting for his current business prospect to give up the pretense of being interested in trying to catch fish. The prospect, who stood a few yards farther up the dock, rod in one hand, was named Dr. Oliver B. McAllen. He was a retired physicist, though less retired than was generally assumed. A dozen years ago, he had rated as one of the country's top men in his line, and, while dressed like an aging tramp in what he had referred to as his fishing togs, he was, at the moment, potentially the country's wealthiest citizen. There was a clandestine invention he'd fathered, which he called the McAllen tube. The tube was the reason Barney Shard had come to see McAllen. Gently raising and lowering the fishing rod and blinking out over the quiet water, Dr. McAllen looked preoccupied with disturbing speculations not connected with his sport. The man had a secrecy bug. The invention, Barney thought, had turned out to be bigger than the inventor. McAllen was afraid of the tube, and in the forefront of his reflections must be the inescapable fact that the secret of the McAllen tube could no longer be kept without Barney Shard's cooperation. Barney had evidence of its existence, and didn't really need the evidence. A few hints dropped here and there would have made McAllen's 12 years of elaborate precaution quite meaningless. Ergo, McAllen must be pondering now, how could one persuade Mr. Shard to remain silent? But there was a second consideration Barney had planted in the old scientist's mind. Mr. Shard, that knowledgeable man of the world, exuded not at all by chance the impression of great quantities of available cash. His manner, the conservatively tailored business suit, the priceless chip of a platinum watch. And McAllen needed cash badly. He'd been fairly wealthy himself at one time, but since he had refrained from exploiting the tube's commercial possibilities, his continuing work with it was exhausting his capital. At least, that could be assumed to be the reason for McAllen's impoverishment, which was a matter Barney had established. In months, the old man would be living on beans. Ergo again, McAllen's thoughts must be running. How might one not merely coax Mr. Shard into silence, but actually get him to come through with some much-needed financial support? What inducement, aside from the tube, could be offered someone in his position? Barney grinned inwardly as he snapped the end of his cigarette out on the amber-tinted water. The mark always sells himself, and McAllen was well along in the process. Polite silence was all that was necessary at the moment. He lit a fresh cigarette, feeling a mild curiosity about the little lake's location. Wisconsin? Minnesota? Michigan? Seemed equally probable guesses. What mattered was that half an hour ago, McAllen's tube had brought them both here in a wink of time from his home in California. Dr. McAllen thoughtfully cleared his throat. "Ever do any fishing, Mr. Shard?" he asked. After getting over his first shock at Barney's revelations, he'd begun speaking again in the brisk, abrupt manner Barney remembered from the last times he'd heard McAllen's voice. "No," Barney admitted, smiling. "Never quite got around to it." "Always been too busy, eh?" "With this and that," Barney agreed. McAllen cleared his throat again. He was a roly-poly little man, over 70 now, but still healthy-looking, with an apple-cheeked, sunburned face. Over a pair of steel-rimmed glasses, his faded blue eyes peered musingly at Barney. "Around 35, aren't you?" 37. "Married?" "Divorced." Any particular hobbies? Barney laughed. I play a little golf, not very seriously. McAllen clicked his tongue. Well, what do you do for fun? Oh, I'd say I enjoy almost anything I get involved in. Barney, still smiling, felt a touch of wariness. He'd been expecting questions from McAllen, but not quite this kind. Mainly making money, eh? Well, McAllen conceded, that's not a bad hobby. Practical, too. Whoop! Just a minute. The tip of the slender rod in his left hand dipped slightly, and 60 feet out beyond the end of the old dock, a green and white bobber began twitching about. Then the bobber suddenly disappeared. McAllen lifted the rod tip a foot or two with a smooth, swift motion and paused. Hooked, he announced, looking almost childishly pleased. The fish on the far end of the line didn't seem to put up much of a struggle, but the old man reeled it in slowly and carefully, giving out line from time to time, then taking it back. He seemed completely absorbed. Not until the fish had been worked close to the dock was there a brief minor commotion near the surface. Then McAllen was down on one knee, holding the rod high with one hand, reached out for his catch with the other. Barney had a glimpse of an unimpressive green and silver disc, reddish froggy eyes. Very nice crappie, McAllen informed him with a broad smile. Now, he placed the rod on the deck, reached down with his other hand. The fish's tail slapped the water. It turned sideways, was gone. Lost it, Barney commented, surprised. Huh? McAllen looked around. Well, no, young man. I turned him loose. He wasn't hooked bad. Crappies have delicate lips, but I use a barbless hook. Gives him a better than fighting chance. He stood up with the rod, dusting the knees of his baggy slacks. Get all the eaten fish I want anyway, he added. You really enjoy that sport, don't you? Barney said curiously. McAllen advised him with the seriousness of a true devotee to try it sometime. It gets to you. It can get to be a way of living. I've been fishing since I was knee-high. 3 years ago, I figured I'd become good enough to write a book on the subject. I got more arguments over that book, sounder arguments too, I'd say, than about any paper I've published in physics. He looked at Barney a moment, still seriously, and went on. I told you wetting a line would calm me down after that upset you gave me. Well, it has. Fishing is as good a form of therapy as I know about. Now, I've been doing some thinking. I'd be interested. Well, I'd like to talk some more about the tube with you, Mr. Shard, and perhaps some other things too. Very gratifying to hear that, Doctor, Barney said gravely. I did regret having to upset you, you know. McAllen shrugged. No harm done. It's given me some ideas. We'll talk right here. He indicated the weather-beaten little cabin on the bank behind Barney. I'm not entirely sure about the California place. That's one reason I suggested this trip. You feel your houseman there mightn't be entirely reliable? Fredericks unreliable? Oh, heavens, no. He knows about the tube, of course, but Fredericks expects me to invent things. It wouldn't occur to him to talk to an outsider. He's been with me for almost 40 years. He was, remarked Barney, listening in on the early part of our conversation today. Well, he'll do that, McAllen agreed. He's very curious about anyone who comes to see me. But otherwise, no. It's just in these days of sophisticated listening devices, one shouldn't ever feel too sure of not being overheard. True enough. Barney glanced up at the cabin. What makes you so sure of it here, Doctor? No reason why anyone would go to the trouble, McAllen said. The property isn't in my name, and the nearest neighbor lives across the lake. I never come here except by tube, so I don't attract any attention. He led the way along the dock. Barney Shard followed, eyes reflectively on the back of McAllen's sunburned neck and the wisps of unclipped white hair sticking out beneath his beaked fishing cap. Barney had learned to estimate accurately the capacity for physical violence in the people he dealt with. He would have offered long odds that neither Dr. McAllen nor Fredericks, the elderly colored man of all work, had the capacity, but Barney's right hand, slid idly into the pocket of his well-tailored coat, was resting on a .25 caliber revolver. This was, after all, a very unusual situation. The human factors in themselves were predictable. Human factors were Barney's specialty, but they were involved with something unknown, the Macallan tube. When it was a question of his personal safety, Barney Shard preferred to take no chances at all. From the top of the worn wooden steps leading up to the cabin, he glanced back at the lake. It occurred to him there should have been at least a suggestion of unreality about that placid body of water, and the sun low and red in the west beyond it. Not that he felt anything of the kind, but less than an hour ago they had been sitting in Macallan's home in Southern California, and beyond the olive green window shades it had been bright daylight. But I really can't imagine. Dr. Macallan had just finished bumbling, his round face a study of controlled dismay on the other side of the desk. Whatever could have brought you to these extraordinary conclusions, young man? Barney had smiled reassuringly, leaned back in his chair. Well, indirectly, sir, as the pictures indicate, we might say that it was your interest in fishing. You see, I happened to notice you on Majorca last month. By itself, the chance encounter on the island had seemed only moderately interesting. Barney was sitting behind the wheel of an ancient automobile near a private home in which a business negotiation of some consequence was being conducted. The business under discussion happened to be Barney's, but it would have been inexpedient for him to attend the meeting in person. Waiting for his associates to wind up the matter, he was passing time by studying an old man who was fishing from a small boat offshore, 100 yards or so below the road. After a while, the old fellow brought the boat in, appeared a few minutes later along the empty lane carrying his tackle and an apparently empty gunny sack, and trudged unheedingly past the automobile and its occupant. As he went by, Barney had a sudden sense of recognition. Then, in a flash, his mind jumped back 12 years. Dr. Oliver B. Macallan. 12 years ago, the name had been an important one in Macallan's field. Then it was not so much forgotten as deliberately buried. Working under government contract at one of the big universities, Macallan had been suddenly and quietly retired. Barney, who had a financial interest in one of the contracts, had made inquiries. He was likely to be out of money if Macallan had been taken from the job. Eventually, he was informed in strict confidence that Dr. Macallan had flipped. Under the delusion of having made a discovery of tremendous importance, he had persuaded the authorities to arrange a demonstration. When the demonstration ended in complete failure, Macallan angrily accused some of his most eminent colleagues of having sabotaged his invention and withdrew from the university. To protect a once great scientist's name, the matter was being hushed up. So, Majorca was where the addled old physicist had elected to end his days. Not a bad choice either, Barney had thought, gazing after the retreating figure. Pleasant island in a beautiful sea. He remembered having heard about Macallan's passion for angling. A day later, the Majorca business profitably concluded, Barney flew back to Los Angeles. That evening he entertained a pair of tanned and shapely ladies whose idea of high fun was to drink all night and go deep-sea fishing at dawn. Barney shuddered inwardly at the latter notion, but promised to see the sporting characters to the Sweetwater Beach Municipal Pier in time to catch a party boat, and did so. One of the girls he noticed not without satisfaction, he had become a little tired of the two before morning, appeared to turn a delicate green as she settled herself into the gently swaying half-day boat beside the wharf. Barney waved them an amiable farewell and was about to go when he noticed a plump old man sitting in the stern of the boat among other anglers, rigging up his tackle. Barney checked sharply and blinked. He was looking at Oliver B. Macallan again. It was almost a minute before he felt sure of it this time. Not that it was impossible for Macallan to be sitting in that boat, but it did seem extremely unlikely. McAllen didn't look the least like a man who could afford nowadays to commute by air between the Mediterranean and California, and Barney felt something else trouble him obscurely as he stared down at the old scientist. A notion of some kind was stirring about in the back quarters of his mind, but refused to be drawn to view just then. He grew aware of what it was while he watched the party boat head out to sea a few minutes later, smiled at what seemed an impossibly fanciful concoction of his unconscious, and started toward the pier's parking lot. But when he had reached his car, climbed in, turned on the ignition, and lit a cigarette, the notion was still with him, and Barney was no longer smiling. Fanciful it was, extremely so. Impossible, in the strictest sense, it was not. The longer he played it around, the more he began to wonder whether his notion mightn't hold water after all. If there was anything to it, he had run into one of the biggest deals in history. Later, Barney realized he would still have let the matter drop there if it hadn't been for other things, having nothing to do with Dr. McAllen. He was between operations at present. His time wasn't occupied. Furthermore, he'd been aware lately that ordinary operations had begun to feel flat. The kick of pulling over a deal, even on some other hard, bright character of his own class, unaccountably was fading. Barney Shard was somewhat frightened because the operator game was the only one he'd ever found interesting. The other role of well-heeled playboy wasn't much more than a manner of killing time. At 37, he was realizing he was bored with life. He didn't like the prospect. Now here was something which might again provide him with some genuine excitement. It could be simply his imagination working overtime, but it wasn't going to do any harm to find out. Mind humming with pleased, though still highly skeptical speculations, Barney went back to the boat station and inquired when the party boat was due to return. He was waiting for it well out of sight as it came chugging up to the wharf some hours later. He had never had anything to do directly with Dr. McAllen, so the old man wouldn't recognize him. But he didn't want to be spotted by his two Amazons, who might feel refreshed enough by now to be ready for another tour of the town. He needn't have worried. The ladies barely made it to the top of the stairs. They phoned for a cab and were presently whisked away. Dr. McAllen, meanwhile, also had made a telephone call and settled down not far from Barney to wait. A small gray car, 5 or 6 years old, but of polished and well-tended appearance, trundled presently up to the pier, came into the turnabout at the boat station and stopped. A thin old Negro, with hair as white as the doctor's, held the door open for McAllen. The car moved unhurriedly off with them. The automobile's license number produced Dr. McAllen's California address for Barney a short while later. The physicist lived in Sweetwater Beach, 15 minutes' drive from the pier, in an old Spanish-type house back in the hills. The chauffeur's name was John Emanuel Fredericks. He'd been working for McAllen for an unknown length of time. No one else lived there. Barney didn't bother with further details about the Sweetwater Beach establishment at the moment. The agencies he usually employed to dig up background information were reasonably trustworthy, and he wanted to attract no more attention than was necessary to his interest in Dr. McAllen. That evening, he took a plane to New York. End of section 1.